So I'm Khorsh. I haven't always been Khorsh. I've been living in Israel now for almost 36 years, and before that I was born in England in 1962, and my parents decided to move to Australia in 1969, and we emigrated to Australia from England. And when I was 23 in Australia, after having spent, I think it was like 15 years, 16 years in Australia, on my own, I made Aliyah to Israel. And it was here that I met my husband, Michael, and I had 3 wonderful children, and now I've got a wonderful granddaughter. So that's the short story. The longer story is my grandparents on one side were from Berlin in Germany, and they escaped from Germany in 1939 with my mother as a baby. And I grew up in England with my mother and my father and in Australia, and never really feeling like I belonged. In Australia, they always told me I was British, and in England you weren't really belonging because you were Jewish or something else. And I just wanted to be in a country and I didn't have to feel out of it. It's a bit like going to the football and you're the only one who's not of that team, and I just didn't like being different. I wanted to be the same as everyone else. I remember when I was a kid in England, my mother was very Zionistic. It was probably from her German background. My grandparents had been to Israel. They came out, they were part of the German delegation, and they were looking at that time also to emigrate to Israel to see if they could make it over here. We have one of my grandfather's cousins actually did make Aliyah to Israel that time, went to Kibbutz Hazariah. But my grandmother took one look at it and said, "No way, I am not moving to that backward country after having grown up in Germany." So they went back to Germany, and eventually they made it to London. So but my grandparents were pretty Zionistic. My mother was very Zionistic, and when my father suggested moving to Australia, she said, "Why don't we go to Israel instead?" And my father said, "No, we're not going to Israel, we're going to Australia." And they went to Australia. But because Israel was so central in my family's life, like I remember very clearly, I was all of 5 years old in the Six-Day War in 1967. And I clearly remember Moshe Dayan and the taking of the old city, because there was such excitement and delight. And I remember there were pictures of Moshe Dayan everywhere, you know, with his eye patch. And, you know, it was just like, to me, this was like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. And then in Australia, you know, the 1973 war as well, we all felt that Israel was going to be destroyed. And it was like, I was devastated just personally, and speaking with friends afterwards, they didn't feel necessarily the same way as what I did. I felt Israel almost viscerally, you know, the pain of Israel, wanting to be part of it. I remember for very many years, people said to me, there's always a question they ask, when would you have liked to have, what thing in history would you have liked to have witnessed? And mine is Hakamat Medina, the establishment of the State of Israel. I wish with all my heart that I would have been here at that point in time. So I made Aliyah in 1986. Israel was not what Israel is today in 1986. It was a very different world. So, you know, so that's who I am, where I've got to.